She arrived with nothing but a suitcase, a bruise she tried to hide beneath her collar, and a secret that could get her killed. He was waiting at the edge of town like a storm that hadn't decided whether to pass or break. Arms crossed, jaw set, eyes the color of flint after a fire. The people of Red Hollow Creek called him dangerous. She was about to find out they were wrong about the danger. It wasn't standing at the station waiting for her. It had already sent men ahead to drag her back. If this story grabs you from the first word, hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far this tale travels. Now sit back. This one runs deep. The stagecoach came in 40 minutes late and smelling like horse sweat and old leather, which meant it arrived exactly on schedule by Red Hollow Creek standards. 3 people climbed out: a traveling salesman with a sample case that kept slipping from his grip, an older farmer who'd been visiting family in Bitterroot and clearly hadn't slept the entire ride, and then her. She stepped down from the coach like someone who had rehearsed the movement 100 times in her head and was now executing it under enormous pressure, careful, deliberate, chin raised just slightly higher than felt natural. One hand held the worn leather handle of her suitcase, the other pressed flat against the side of the coach for a single half second, as if she needed to feel something solid before she let go entirely. Then she let go. She stood in the dirt street of Red Hollow Creek, Wyoming territory, in the autumn of 1883, and she looked around at the town the way a person looks at a place they've chosen. Not because it was good, but because it was far. Her name was Evelyn Mercer. She was 26 years old. She had $31 in her coat pocket, a single letter folded against her ribs, and a split lip she'd covered with powder that was already starting to fade. Nobody in Red Hollow Creek knew any of that yet. What they saw was a young woman, dark hair pinned back, but with 2 pieces coming loose from the long ride, dress that had been quality 6 months ago and was now starting to show the kind of wear that comes from living rough in respectable clothes. She was pretty in an angular, serious way that made people look twice and then feel vaguely unsettled, like they couldn't quite place her. What they also saw, within about 30 seconds of her arrival, was Boone Callahan walking toward her from the far end of the street. The crowd at the station, and it was a crowd, because Red Hollow Creek had approximately 400 residents and almost nothing to do on a Thursday afternoon, went quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when something they've been gossiping about for 3 weeks is suddenly standing right in front of them. Boone Callahan was 41 years old and looked it. Not in the soft sense. He didn't look worn down. He looked like a man who had been weathered, the way good wood gets weathered, harder, tighter grained, less inclined to split. He stood 6'2", carried about 210 pounds of it without apparent effort, and walked the way men walk when they've spent 20 years on horseback, slightly rolling in the shoulders, unhurried, like the ground belonged to him, and he was simply passing through it for now. He wasn't handsome in any conventional sense. His nose had been broken at least twice. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw that he'd never once explained to anyone in town. His eyes were a pale, water-washed gray that people consistently described, after meeting him, as either unsettling or like looking at something very far away. He hadn't been to a social event in 4 years. He picked up his own mail. He hired hands and paid them fair wages and didn't socialize with them. He had not, in the collective memory of Red Hollow Creek, ever laughed in public. And now he was walking toward the woman who had apparently agreed, through a series of letters and the arrangement of a fee, to marry him. The salesman with the slipping case stepped sideways. The farmer angled toward the feed store. Everyone else just watched. Boone stopped about 4 feet from her. She had her eyes on him before he was close, had picked him out of the street the moment he started walking, because there was nobody else it could have been. The description in his letter had been, tall, dark hat, will be at the station, which wasn't much, but the way he moved had told her everything his letter hadn't. She didn't look afraid. She'd used up most of her fear reserves over the last 2 months, and what was left she'd packed down somewhere she couldn't easily reach. "Mr. Callahan?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the one small mercy of the afternoon. "Miss Mercer." He glanced at her suitcase. Just the one. He didn't comment on it. "You have a long ride?" 3 days from Cheyenne. "Eat anything today?" She hesitated. "I had some bread this morning." He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that gave nothing away. Then he said, "There's a place on Birch Street that's decent. We'll go there first." He picked up her suitcase before she could object, turned, and started walking back up the street. She stood there for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register that this was not the reception she'd imagined in any of the versions she'd run through her head. And then she followed him. Behind her, she heard someone mutter something. She didn't catch the words, but she heard the tone and the low ripple of laughter that came after. She kept walking. The restaurant on Birch Street was called Ida's, and it was 3 tables, a counter, and a woman named Ida who ran the whole operation herself and had opinions about everything. Boone sat with his back to the wall. Evelyn noticed he did it without thinking, the automatic positioning of a man who didn't like to be approached from behind. She filed that away. Ida brought coffee without being asked and set it down with the particular energy of a woman who wanted very badly to ask questions and was working hard to suppress the instinct. "You want the stew?" she asked Evelyn. "Please." "You?" she said to Boone. "Same." Ida went back to the kitchen. Through the window, Evelyn could see 2 women on the street outside slow their pace as they passed, craning their necks. "People stare at you a lot," she said. "They stare at you today. Me, they're used to." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It was real coffee, not the chicory mess the coach stop in Laramie had been passing off, and the warmth of it moved through her hands and into her arms, and she had to work not to close her eyes. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her across the table, waiting. "The arrangement we made. In the letters." She chose her words the way someone picks their footing on uncertain ground. "I was honest about most of it. I'm a hard worker. I know books and figures. I've run a household. Everything I told you about what I can contribute, that's true. But," he said, "but I left out why I'm here." She met his eyes directly, because she'd decided on the coach that she was going to do it this way. Straight through, no dancing around it. "I'm not here because I couldn't find a husband back east. I'm here because I had one. A fiancé. And I left him, and he isn't the kind of man who accepts that." Silence. The kitchen clattered. Outside, a cart horse made a noise of protest at something. "So there's someone looking for you," Boone said. It wasn't a question. "There will be, if he isn't already." "What kind of man is he?" She thought about how to answer that. There were a lot of accurate things she could say. She went with, "The kind who owns people and calls it love." Boone looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You going to be a problem for this ranch?" She blinked. It wasn't the question she'd expected. "Excuse me? I've got 23 head of cattle, 4 horses, 2 hired hands who are barely competent, and more accounts in the red than I'd like. I asked for someone who could help me run it. Are you still that person, or did I just spend $112 on a complication?" She stared at him. Then, to her own surprise, she said, "Both, probably." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. She wasn't sure his face did that. But a fractional shift in the set of his jaw that might have been the beginning of one. "Fair enough," he said. Ida brought the stew. He showed her the ranch that evening, just before the light went flat and gray, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in the span of an hour, the way it did in Wyoming in late October. The ranch was called Callahan Land on the deed, and nothing at all in practice. It was just the place, the way people who live somewhere a long time stop needing to name it. It sat on a low rise about 2 miles east of town, edged on 3 sides by open range and on the 4th by a creek that ran decent water 9 months of the year and a trickle the other 3. It was not a pretty place. It had been, maybe once, or at least it had the bones of something that could have been decent if someone had kept after it. But the barn needed 2 boards replaced on the south side. The fence along the east pasture was sagging in 3 places. The house itself was solid. Stone foundation, real timber framing, the kind of construction that takes effort and means someone built it to last. But it had the look of a place that hadn't been tended in a while, like a jacket that's good quality but badly in need of pressing. "I'll get you set up in the east room," Boone said. "It has a door that bolts from the inside." She looked at him. "I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "The arrangement was for a working partnership. I didn't bring you out here for anything else. The bolt's there if you want it." "I want it," she said, not because she thought she needed it from him necessarily, but because having it would mean she could sleep. He nodded once. "Fine." He showed her the room. It was small, with a window that faced east, a iron frame bed with a quilt that had seen better years, and a washstand with a basin and a pitcher. There was a hook on the back of the door for clothes and nothing else in the way of amenity. But the door had a bolt, a real one, heavy iron, the kind that doesn't give. Evelyn set her suitcase down and stood in the middle of the room and breathed. "I'll leave you to it," Boone said from the doorway. "Mr. Callahan." He paused. "Thank you for not asking more questions at dinner." He considered that for a moment, one hand on the doorframe. "I've got questions," he said. "I just don't need the answers tonight." He went down the hallway. She heard his boots on the stairs, measured and unhurried. Then the creak of the floorboards below, moving toward what she'd already identified as his study. She slid the bolt home, and for the first time in 63 days, she slept without listening for footsteps outside her door. The first week was difficult in the specific way that adjusting to a new life is always difficult. Not dramatic, just relentlessly demanding. She was up before dawn the first morning because she'd been up before dawn every morning for most of her life, and her body hadn't gotten the message that she was in a new place with potentially new rules. She came downstairs to find the kitchen cold and the stove unlit and a note on the table in Boone's handwriting, blunt, functional, no nonsense, that said, "Coffee in the tin. Hands eat at 6. Don't bother with anything fancy." She built the fire, found the tin, and started the coffee. By the time Boone came in from the barn at 5:30 with cold hands and mud on his boots, there was coffee on the stove and she was working her way through a ledger she'd found on the kitchen shelf that appeared to be his financial records for the past year. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "You went through my books," he said. "I can add." She didn't look up. "You've been paying 17 cents a pound for feed when the outfit in Laramie offers the same grade for 12. That's a 5-cent difference on what looks like—" She ran her finger down a column. "Roughly 300 pounds a month. You're losing $15 every month just on that one line item." A beat of silence. "Laramie's 2 days out," he said. "There's a regional buyer that comes through Bitterroot twice a month. Same product. I'd have to write to confirm the rate, but you're going to fix my books. I'm going to look at your books. Then I'm going to tell you what I see. What you do with that is your business." He came to the table, poured himself coffee, and sat down across from her. "What else do you see?" She turned the ledger toward him and started at the top. The two ranch hands were named Curtis and Pete. Curtis was 40-something and had been with the ranch for 6 years and had the slow, careful manner of a man who'd worked hard all his life and intended to keep doing it without fuss or drama. Pete was 23 and not particularly competent, but he tried, which Evelyn decided early on was worth more than she'd been led to believe. They regarded her arrival with the cautious skepticism of men who had seen the ranch's finances get worse every year and weren't sure whether this new development was going to help or accelerate the decline. Curtis, on the third day, said to her, he had a wife before. She was repairing a section of fence near the east pasture because the sagging she'd noticed on the first evening had turned out to be worse than it looked, and someone needed to deal with it. "I know," she said. "She died. Her and the boy both. 7 years back." Evelyn kept working the wire. "He told me." "He tell you much about it?" "He told me they were gone. He didn't tell me more than that, and I didn't ask more than that." Curtis squinted at her. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone softer." She pulled the wire taut and fastened it. "People from the East usually think they need to be soft. They change their minds after about a week out here." Curtis looked at the fence line, then back at her. Then he picked up the next post and handed it over without being asked, and that was more or less the end of his skepticism. Town was harder. Red Hollow Creek had a preacher named Aldous Finch, who had strong opinions about the moral character of a woman who would travel across the territory to marry a man she'd never met, and he wasn't shy about sharing them from the steps of the church, or the porch of the general store, or anywhere else he happened to be standing when Evelyn walked past. "Mercenary arrangement," she heard him say to the wife of one of the merchants, not bothering to lower his voice. "No different than those women in the frontier houses, if you want my honest assessment." She kept walking. She'd learned young that responding to men like Aldous Finch cost you something you didn't get back. There were others. The wife of the county land agent, a Mrs. Helena Marsh who wore her status the way some women wear perfume, aggressively and in too much quantity, who stopped Evelyn in front of the dry goods store one afternoon to ask, with studied sweetness, how she was adjusting to life with poor Boone, as if he were a burden she'd taken on out of charity. "He seems to be adjusting fine," Evelyn said. "Well, he was always particular. I suppose some women don't mind that." "I suppose not," Evelyn said, and went into the store. What she'd learned in her first 2 weeks in Red Hollow Creek was this. The town had decided Boone was dangerous, and they'd built a whole story around that decision. The story wasn't entirely wrong. He was hard and cold and not remotely interested in making people comfortable, Bouchette. But it was about 10 years out of date and missing about half the relevant facts. What the town called dangerous, Evelyn was starting to understand as something different. It was grief that had never been allowed to finish moving through him. She found out more by accident than design. She'd gone into his study one evening to return the ledger she'd been working through, and she'd set it on the desk and was turning to leave when she saw the photograph on the shelf. It was small, framed in plain wood, the kind of portrait that traveling photographers made in the frontier towns during the 70s. A woman, younger than Evelyn, with an open face and dark eyes, holding an infant against her shoulder. The woman was laughing at something off camera, really laughing, not posing, caught mid-breath. Evelyn stood there looking at it for longer than she meant to. "Her name was Clara," Boone said from the doorway. She turned. He was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, and he didn't look angry, just tired in the deep structural way of someone who's been tired for a very long time. "I'm sorry," she said. "I wasn't trying to pry." "She was funny," he said. "That's what people forget. They remember she was pretty, but she made you laugh before you even knew what happened." He looked at the photograph, not at Evelyn. "The boy was 8 months. Name was Thomas. How did they— Fever. Came through fast that winter. Half the county got sick." His jaw moved. "I was out on the North Range. Didn't get back in time." The room held that. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said again, and this time she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the appropriate social response. He looked at her finally. "I didn't bring you here as a replacement. I want you to know that." "I know. I brought you here because this place needs someone who can help keep it together. And because—" He stopped. "Because?" she asked. "Because I recognize what it looks like when someone's running," he said quietly. "And I thought maybe two people who needed something solid might be able to give each other that. Even if it's not the conventional arrangement." She thought about that. "That might be the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me about a marriage," she told him. He made a sound that was probably as close to a laugh as he got. "That's either a good sign about us or a terrible sign about your past." "Both, probably," she said, which was the second time she'd said that to him, and this time he did smile, just barely, the corner of his mouth, gone almost before it arrived. He went back down the hallway. She stood in the study for a moment longer, looking at the photograph of Clara, who had laughed with her whole face, and the small child she was holding, who would have been 7 years old now. Then she turned off the lamp and went to bed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in November, just under a month after Evelyn had come to Red Hollow Creek. It came addressed to her, not to Boone, which meant whoever sent it knew where she was, had tracked her that far at minimum. She recognized the handwriting before she got the envelope fully open. She'd seen it on birthday cards and contract documents, and twice, on notes slipped under her bedroom door in the middle of the night that were meant to sound like affection and read like threats. "Evelyn, I know you've lost your way. I know you've made choices in a moment of confusion that you must already be regretting. There is no judgment on my part, only concern. The arrangement you've entered into with this frontier laborer cannot possibly be what you want for yourself. Come home. I will have men in Red Hollow Creek by the end of the month. They will be there to assist you in whatever way you require. Warmly, Damien." She read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully and held it in both hands and sat at the kitchen table and did not move for approximately 3 minutes. Then she got up, put the letter in her coat pocket, went out to the barn, and found Boone replacing a cracked board on one of the stalls. "I need to show you something," she said. He read it without comment. His expression didn't change through the reading, which she'd learned was not a sign of indifference, but of concentration, the way some people go very still when they're thinking hardest. When he was done, he handed it back. "He's coming," she said. It wasn't a question. "Sounds like?" "Boone." She said his name plainly, no framing around it. He has money, significant money, and connections, territorial officials, lawyers. He's not someone who gets told no. Everybody gets told no eventually. Not men like him, not usually. She looked at him directly. I need to know if you're going to... She stopped, started again. I need to know what you're going to do when he gets here. Because if you're going to hand me over or stand aside or... I'm not, he said. She searched his face. You don't know him. You don't know what he's capable of. Evelyn. His voice was quiet and completely flat, the way a stone wall is flat. You're on my land. You came here under an agreement, and I kept my end of it. And nothing about that changes because some man from Boston has got money and doesn't understand the word no. He comes here, he'll find out what it means. She held his gaze for a long moment. You're sure, she said. I'm sure. She nodded once. Her throat felt strange. She'd asked for help before, not directly because asking directly had consequences, and she'd always gotten either silence or worse. This was the first time anyone had answered with that specific quality of certainty. All right, she said, then we need to figure out how to be ready. The month that followed was the most exhausted and productive stretch of Evelyn's adult life. She threw herself into the work of the ranch with the single-minded focus of someone who needs not to think about what's coming. She rebuilt the account books from scratch, identified 3 suppliers that Boone could switch to at better rates, negotiated a cattle deal with a buyer out of Casper that finally put the ranch in the black for the first time in 2 years. She learned to ride. Not well, not yet, but well enough to work the fence line without falling off, which Boone said was a reasonable starting point. She learned to read the sky, because out here the sky told you things an hour before they happened if you knew how to listen. She learned which of the ranch's horses could be trusted and which were liars. There was a bay mare named Trouble, who was genuinely, deliberately difficult, and Pete had told her just to leave that one alone. But Evelyn had spent 3 mornings talking to her through the stall gate before Trouble had made her peace with the situation. She doesn't do that for anyone, Curtis said one morning, watching Evelyn ride Trouble around the near pasture at a canter. Boone was standing beside him. No, he said. Interesting. Yeah, Boone said in the way he said things he wasn't going to elaborate on. In the evenings, after supper, they fell into the habit of sitting in the main room with the fire going and the accounts spread between them, or with her reading and him going over the next day's work, or sometimes just the fire and silence that didn't feel like it needed filling. She told him pieces of it slowly, over several evenings. Not all at once. She didn't have it in her to tell it all at once, but pieces. She told him about her family in Providence, the father who'd had money once and lost it, and never quite recovered from the loss. She told him about being introduced to Damien Ashford at 22 when she'd been green enough and desperate enough to mistake possessiveness for devotion. She told him about the slow narrowing of her life. Fewer friends, fewer places she was allowed to go without explanation, fewer thoughts she was allowed to have out loud. It was never one big thing, she said one evening, looking at the fire. Nothing you could point to and say, this is when it went wrong. It just got smaller, all of it, like a room with the walls slowly moving in. Boone was quiet for a moment. And you ran. I waited too long, and then I ran. She looked down at her hands. I had a friend, Margaret. She helped me. Got me the money for the ticket, the contact information for the agency. If it weren't for her, I'd still be in that room. Where's she now? I don't know. That's the part that... She stopped. I don't know if he knows about her. I don't know what he did when I left. I wrote to her from Cheyenne, and I haven't heard back, and I don't know if the letter got through or if she's... She stopped again. Hey, Boone said. He didn't move toward her, didn't make any reaching gesture, but his voice shifted into something that wasn't softer exactly, but had more space in it. She helped you get out. Whatever happened after, she did that. I know. That counts? I know. She exhaled. I just don't want her to have paid a price for it. They sat with that for a while. Tell me about him, Boone said finally. Damien. Not what he did, what he's like, how he operates. She looked at him. Why? Because if he's coming, I want to know what I'm dealing with. Not the monster version, the real version. What does he do when he wants something? She thought about it. He smiles, she said. That's the first thing. He has a very good smile. He makes you feel, when he decides you matter, he makes you feel like the whole room has turned in your direction, like you're the most interesting thing that's happened to him in years. And then? And then he starts learning what you need, what you're afraid of, what you want. And he uses all of it. Not cruelly, at first. He gives you some of what you need and takes something in return, and you don't notice the exchange until you're so far in you can't see where the door was. He's patient, Boone said. Very. Rich? His family made it in shipping and then textiles. He doubled what he inherited in 10 years. He has lawyers in 4 states and at least 2 territorial officials I know of that he's paid favors to. He'll come in publicly, Boone said, half to himself. Make it look legitimate, some kind of legal angle. That's what he does. He never looks like the villain. He makes you look like the problem. Boone nodded slowly, looking at the fire. All right, he said. All right, what? All right, now I know what I'm dealing with. He stood, picked up the poker, and adjusted the fire. Get some sleep. We've got a fence section to finish tomorrow, and I want to be done before the weather turns. She stared at him. That's it? That's your response? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Something that indicates you understand what's coming. He looked at her over his shoulder. I understand. I've been dealing with men who think they can take what belongs on my land for 20 years. They're always surprised when they can't. She thought about pointing out that she wasn't property, that the framing of that sentence was, I know you're not property, he said, reading her expression with an accuracy that was slightly unnerving. I meant the land and the livestock. You'd be a separate category, one I take equally seriously. She let out a long breath. You're the most exasperating man. So I've been told. He set down the poker. Good night, Evelyn. She watched him go. Then she banked the fire herself, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. She didn't bolt the door that night. She wasn't sure when she'd stop doing that. Damien Ashford arrived in Red Hollow Creek on a Thursday in late November, in a hired carriage that was too expensive for the roads out here and had to be helped through a muddy stretch of the main street by 2 men with boards. He stepped out, looking like he'd arrived at a social function in Boston. Dark coat, gold watch chain, hat that had probably cost more than Curtis made in 2 months. He was 40 years old, dark-haired, and handsome in the specific, curated way of men who've always known they were handsome and have incorporated it into their self-presentation the way other men incorporate a good handshake. He smiled at the first person he saw on the street, a woman named Ruth Delancey who ran the post office, and the smile was warm and measured and calibrated to make you feel like he'd been hoping specifically to meet you. Good afternoon, he said. I wonder if you could help me. I'm looking for a young woman. My fiancée, Evelyn Mercer. I believe she may have come through this area. Ruth Delancey, who had, in the way of small towns, heard that a man was coming for the Callahan woman before Damien's carriage had made it through the muddy stretch, said, I couldn't say. The smile didn't waver. Of course. Thank you for your time. He took a room at the hotel, which was the only hotel, and sent cards to the county land agent and the town's one lawyer and the man who claimed to be the regional representative of the territorial governor's office. He did not go to the ranch that first day. He was patient. That was always how he worked. Evelyn knew he was there before she was officially told, because Pete came back from town that afternoon with his eyes wide and the expression of a man who'd seen something that worried him. There's a fellow at the hotel, Pete said. Expensive looking, asking around about a Miss Mercer. She was in the kitchen, hands in flour, making bread because it was something to do with her hands when her mind was moving too fast. How many men with him? She asked. Pete blinked. 3 that I saw. She nodded, kept working the dough. Miss Mercer. Evelyn, she said. She'd been telling him for 3 weeks. Evelyn, what do you want us to do? She thought about the letter, the smiles she remembered, the way Damien had a system for everything, a method, a series of moves planned several steps ahead. Go get Mr. Callahan, she said. Tell him he's here. Pete went. She kept working the dough. Her hands were shaking, but they were still moving, which she figured was the best she could ask for. Boone came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. He's here, he said. I know. He'll probably come out here tomorrow or the day after. after he's made whatever arrangements he's going to make in town. I know. Evelyn. She looked up at him. Are you all right? She considered the question seriously. No, she said, but I'm not going back. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at her for a long moment. That gray, steady gaze that she'd come to understand was not coldness, but something closer to its opposite. It was the look of a man who was paying very close attention. No, he agreed. They're not. He came into the kitchen, poured himself coffee, and sat down at the table. Tell me what he'll do first, he said. And she told him. They talked until his bread was done, and then they talked through dinner, and then they talked in the firelight until the wind picked up outside and set the windows rattling in their frames. The frontier night pressed against the glass, cold and indifferent. Inside, two people who had each been running from different kinds of damage sat across a table and started, for the first time, making a plan that didn't involve running at all. The next morning came in cold and gray, the kind of November sky that sits low and presses down on everything beneath it. Evelyn was up before the fire had taken the chill out of the kitchen, and she stood at the window with her coffee and watched the frost on the pasture grass catch what little light there was. She had not slept well. Not for any single dramatic reason. No nightmares, no sounds in the night. Just the particular sleeplessness of someone who has made a decision and is now waiting for the world to catch up to it. Boone came in from the barn at 5:45, same as every morning, mud on his boots and cold on his hands, and he poured coffee and sat at the table and looked over the notes she'd left from the previous night's conversation. The plan they'd worked out, such as it was. Rough at the edges. More framework than blueprint. He read through it without expression, then he set it down. He'll come today, he said. Probably not today. He'll spend today establishing himself in town, making sure everyone knows who he is. He'll want the narrative in place before he comes out here. Narrative. He'll tell people I'm confused, vulnerable, that I came out here on some impulsive mistake and he's here to help me. He won't say anything outright ugly. He never does. He'll just make sure that when he comes for me, there are people watching who already feel sorry for him. Boone's jaw moved, and they'll believe him. Some will. He's very good at being believed. She refilled her coffee and sat down across from him. In the pale morning light, she could see the lines around his eyes more clearly than usual. The particular erosion of a man who'd spent 15 years outdoors and hadn't had many easy ones. She thought about what he'd said weeks ago, the night he'd told her about Clara. Two people who needed something solid. At the time, she'd filed it as practical. She understood now it was also honest in a way most people didn't manage. I want to go into town this morning, she said. He looked at her. Why? Because if I hide out here, it looks like I have something to be ashamed of. And because there are people in this town who haven't made up their minds about me yet. And I'd rather they see me walking around on my own 2 feet before Damien tells them I can't manage it. A pause. Then Boone said, I'll take you in. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He stood and put his cup in the basin. I'll get the wagon. She opened her mouth, then closed it. There were arguments she could make, that she didn't need an escort, that she was capable of managing the town on her own, that being accompanied by Boone might itself become part of whatever story Damien was telling. All of those things were probably true. But sitting in the cold kitchen with the plan they'd made the night before still on the table between them, she thought about the quality of his answer from the previous evening. I'm not going to hand you over or stand aside. Not dramatic, just flat and sure. She let him take her into town. Red Hollow Creek on a Friday morning was as busy as it got, which was not very busy by any standard she'd known in Providence or Boston, but felt substantial in context. The dry goods store had a small queue. The post office had 2 people waiting. The street held a handful of wagons and horses, and people moving between errands with their breath clouding in the cold air. Damien was at the hotel, presumably. She didn't see him. What she did see, what she felt, more accurately, was the way the town's attention shifted when Boone helped her down from the wagon. People noticed. They always noticed Boone, and now they noticed her with him. And she could feel the calculation happening in real time as people tried to decide which version of the story they were going to believe. She went to the dry goods store first. Mrs. Paulson, who ran the counter, was a woman in her 60s who had the manner of someone who'd seen enough of life to have opinions about most of it, but was occasionally willing to suspend judgment. Morning, Evelyn said. I need to put in an order for the ranch. Morning. Mrs. Paulson looked at her, not unkindly, but measuring. Heard there's a man in town looking for you. I heard the same. Says you're his fiancée. I was once. I'm not now. She put the list on the counter. I'm Evelyn Callahan. I've been living on the Callahan Ranch for a month, and I'm intending to continue doing so. Mrs. Paulson looked at the list, then at Evelyn. He seems like a smooth sort of man. He is. He's very smooth. Evelyn met her eyes. I'd ask you to remember that smooth isn't the same as honest. The older woman was quiet for a moment. Then she took the list and started pulling items. They didn't speak much after that, but when Evelyn left with her order, Mrs. Paulson said, You come back if you need anything, in the tone of someone who means more by it than the words say. It wasn't much, but it was something. She was outside the post office when she heard his voice. Evelyn. She had known, on some level, that it was possible, that he might be up early, or have someone watching the street, or simply have the same instinct he'd always had for appearing at the moment she least wanted him to. She had rehearsed, mentally, how this would go, what she would say, how she would stand. None of it felt useful now that he was actually there. Damien Ashford stood on the boardwalk 20 feet from her, and he looked exactly as he always had, polished, composed. That particular quality of stillness that he had which made him seem like the only still point in any moving scene. He was dressed for the cold but not rumpled by it. He looked at her the way he always looked at her in public, which was with a warm, worried concern that could break your heart if you didn't know what lived behind it. I've been so worried, he said. He didn't move toward her. He was careful about that in public. Never rushed, never forceful, nothing anyone could point to. When I got your note, Evelyn, do you have any idea what it's been like not knowing where you were? She was aware that 3 people on the street had slowed to listen. She was aware of Boone somewhere behind her because she'd heard his boots stop when she'd stopped, and she knew without turning that he was there. Damien, she said. Her voice was even. She'd had to work for it. I know you got my note. I left it to tell you I was leaving. I've left. The matter is concluded. His expression shifted. Not to anger, nothing so legible. Something softer, pained. Evelyn, you're not well. The pressure, the stress. I understand it, I do, but this isn't. I'm perfectly well, she said. You left everything. You traveled across the territory alone. You entered into an arrangement with a man you'd never met. He gestured very slightly in the direction of Boone. This isn't the behavior of someone making clear decisions. I disagree. Evelyn, I'm going to ask you not to come to the ranch. She said it clearly, each word measured. I'm going to ask you to leave Red Hollow Creek. There is nothing for you here. The smile that crossed his face was almost imperceptible. A fractional shift, here and gone. The smile of a man who has just had confirmed what he'd already suspected. That this was going to be the kind of situation that required the other approaches. The legal ones. The ones with teeth. I'm not leaving, he said quietly, pleasantly. You're my fiancée. I came here to help you. I'm going to do that. He glanced past her at Boone. I'd like to speak with your employer. I'm her husband, Boone said. He'd moved up beside her without her realizing it, not close enough to crowd her, just there, which was all she needed. And she asked you to leave. Something moved across Damien's face then, not the smile. Something underneath it. That's not possible, he said. There was no legal. We were married 3 weeks ago, Evelyn said. This was true. Boone had arranged it quietly with a traveling justice of the peace who came through monthly because they'd both agreed that whatever was coming, it was better to have the legal standing in place. By a justice of the peace, the papers are filed in the county seat. The street had gone very quiet. Damien looked at her, then at Boone, then back at her, and there was a moment, brief, just a flash, where the pleasant concern fell away entirely, and she saw what was actually underneath it, and it was the same thing she'd always seen when she'd pushed too far, and it was not good. Then the mask came back. I'll need to speak with a lawyer, he said pleasantly. That's your right, Boone said. Damien adjusted his hat, nodded once, a controlled, civilized gesture, and walked back toward the hotel. His footsteps were even and unhurried on the boardwalk. Evelyn breathed. You all right? Boone said, low beside her. Yes. A pause. Ask me again in 10 minutes. We should go. Not yet. She turned to face the three people who had been watching. She recognized two of them. The newspaper editor, a thin man named Garrett Cole who was always looking for something worth printing, and one of the merchants who'd been skeptical of her since the first week. Good morning, she said, with a composure she did not entirely feel. Cold for November. Garrett Cole looked at her with the sharp, careful expression of a man deciding whether this is his business. Then he said, Indeed it is. She nodded and walked to the wagon. Her hands didn't stop shaking until they were a mile out of town. The next several days moved on two tracks simultaneously. The surface of ordinary ranch life, and underneath it, the slow, mounting pressure of Damien working through the town like water, finding every available crack. He was methodical about it, as she'd known he would be. He had lunch with the county land agent and emerged an hour later looking satisfied. He visited the lawyer's office twice. He attended a meeting at the town hall that had something to do with territorial land rights. He was pleasant to everyone, generous with his time, and he told a version of the story that had Evelyn as a fragile, confused young woman who had run from her responsibilities in a moment of mental instability and been taken advantage of by an opportunistic man. He didn't say it quite that plainly. He never did. But by the third day, Pete reported hearing it at the feed store. And by the fourth day, Reverend Finch had apparently included a pointed remark in his Sunday address about the dangers of fraudulent matrimonial arrangements. And by the fifth day, there was a formal letter from the county land agent's office questioning the validity of the water rights claim Boone had held unchallenged for 9 years. That last one landed on the kitchen table at breakfast and sat there between them like a bruise. Boone read it twice. His expression didn't change, which Evelyn had stopped mistaking for calm, and understood now was something he did deliberately when something angered him deeply enough to require management. The water rights, she said. He knows the ranch can't operate without that water access. Without it, the east pasture is useless through summer. He's not coming after us directly. He's coming after what holds us together. Yeah. Boone set the letter down. That's smart. He's always smart. She looked at the letter. We need someone on our side in town, not just people who are neutral, someone with standing. Cole, Boone said. She looked up. The newspaper. If this becomes a story that's already told one way, he can tell it another. You think he'd do that? I think Garrett Cole has been waiting for something worth printing for about 3 years, and Damien Ashford just handed it to him. She thought about it. Cole had been watching the scene on the street with that particular attention of someone storing information. He hadn't looked convinced by Damien, but he'd also been a long way from convinced by her. He'd need something, she said, not just our word against Damien's. The letter, Boone said, the one Damien sent you, and the ones before it, if you kept them. She had kept them. She'd kept all of them, folded into the lining of her suitcase, for exactly the reason she'd kept every piece of paper that had ever passed between her and Damien. Because she'd understood early that documentation was the only protection available to someone in her position. I have them, she said. Then we go talk to Cole. Garrett Cole's office was small, ink-smelling, and organized in the chaotic private logic of a man who knew where everything was and didn't care that no one else did. He was in his mid-40s, thin to the point of looking slightly underfed, with the distracted manner of someone whose brain was always working 2 problems at once. He listened to them for 20 minutes without interrupting, which impressed Evelyn. Most men interrupted. When they were done, he looked at the letters she'd laid on his desk. May I? She nodded. He read through 2 of them. Slowly, carefully. Then he set them down and looked at Boone. You've had dealings with his kind before? Rich men leveraging territory connections to push people off land? Different versions of the same thing, twice, Boone said. What happened those times? First time, they got the land. Second time, they didn't. What changed the second time? Boone was quiet for a moment. People got tired of being scared. Cole tapped a finger on the desk. He looked at Evelyn. He's been to see the land agent, the county recorder, and the magistrate. You know that? I assumed. The water rights challenge is real. He's found a procedural gap in the original filing. It's thin, but it gives him something to argue. Cole looked at the letters again. These, though, these are interesting. This one in particular, he pointed at the third letter. This is a man trying to establish a legal narrative. He's not writing to a lost fiancé. He's writing a document he expects to use. I know, Evelyn said. That's why I kept them. Cole looked at her with a different quality of attention than he'd been giving her. You planned for this, he said. I planned to need evidence someday. I just didn't know for what. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, someone drove a cart past on the street. The window rattled. I can write the story, Cole said finally. I won't promise it'll do everything you need, but I can put your account on the record publicly, which makes it harder for him to run the other version unopposed. He paused. I'd need to be able to print the relevant portions of the letters. With your consent. You have it, she said. Cole nodded slowly. Come back tomorrow afternoon. I'll have questions. They stood to leave. At the door, Cole said, Mrs. Callahan. She turned. The water rights challenge. Tell Boone to pull his original deed and compare the parcel numbers to the challenge filing. I think there's a clerical error in Ashford's paperwork that makes it legally void, but he'll need to catch it fast. She looked at Boone. He was already calculating. Thank you, she said. Cole waved a hand. He was already turning back to his desk, his mind somewhere ahead of the room. The clerical error was real. Boone found it that evening, 2 hours of going over the papers in lamplight with Evelyn beside him, reading every line twice. It was a transposed parcel number in Damien's challenge filing, the kind of small mistake that shouldn't have made it through a competent lawyer's review, which suggested either Damien's local legal help was not particularly competent or the filing had been rushed. Either way, it was ammunition. Curtis, who had been listening to all of this from the kitchen doorway in the way that Curtis operated, present, quiet, absorbing, said, You want me to ride to the county seat tomorrow? File the response? Boone looked at him. That's a full day's ride. I know what it is, Curtis said. A pause. Yeah, Boone said. Take Pete with you. Get there and back before Ashford figures out the error's been caught. Curtis nodded and went to bed. Pete, who'd been listening from the other doorway, looked faintly alarmed at the prospect of the ride, but squared his jaw and went to bed too. Evelyn looked at Boone across the table of papers. This isn't over, she said. Not a warning, just a statement of what was true. No, he agreed. He'll push harder when the water rights challenge fails. He'll find something else. Probably. Are you? She stopped, started again, more honestly. Are you sorry? That you answered the letter, that I came here? He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. No, he said, even with all of this. Even with all of this. He looked at her steadily. This ranch has been slowly dying for 4 years. I'd convinced myself I preferred it that way. He looked down at the papers. I was wrong about that. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, the accounts are in the black this month. First time in 2 years, you said. Yeah. The Casper cattle deal goes through next month and puts us another $60 ahead. I know. I'm just saying. She gestured vaguely at the papers, at the window, at all of it. We built something here, in a month, despite everything. He looked at her. In the lamplight, with the papers spread between them, and the cold pressing against the windows, and somewhere outside Curtis getting his gear ready for a long, hard ride, something in his expression shifted into something that was more than just tired or steady, or the bleak functionality she'd first met. It was something quieter and more complicated. Yeah, he said. We did. Outside, the wind picked up and set something rattling against the barn wall, and neither of them moved to check what it was. They just kept sitting there in the light, with the work of building something real spread between them, and the knowledge that someone was out there planning to take it apart. That knowledge had a weight to it, but it wasn't crushing. Not anymore. It had started to feel instead like something worth fighting for. Curtis and Pete made the ride to the county seat, and back in 31 hours, which was faster than it should have been and left Pete barely able to walk straight for 2 days afterward. But the response to the water rights challenge was filed, the clerical error was flagged in the official record, and the challenge was formally suspended pending review, which, in the language of territorial bureaucracy, meant Damien's first legal move had been neutralized. It did not make Damien go away. If anything, it made him sharper. Evelyn had known it would. She'd seen him lose small battles before. A contract that fell through. A business rival who pushed back harder than expected. and she'd watched how he processed those losses. Not with anger, at least not visibly. With recalibration. He went quiet for a day or two, and then he came back at a different angle, and the new angle was always worse than the first one. So she was not surprised when, on the first Monday of December, a stranger appeared at the ranch gate. He wasn't one of the men she'd seen arrive with Damien. He was local. She could tell by his clothes and his horse and the way he sat the saddle, someone who'd grown up on the territory rather than traveled into it. He was maybe 50, with a sheriff's badge on his coat that she recognized as the county deputy's, not the town's. Boone met him at the gate. "Mr. Callahan." The deputy had the manner of a man who didn't love his current assignment. "I've got a document here from the territorial magistrate's office. Order of inquiry into the validity of the marriage filing dated November 2nd. Boone took the document, read it, handed it to Evelyn. She read it. The language was formal and dense, but the substance was plain. Damien had filed a challenge claiming the marriage ceremony had been conducted improperly, that the justice of the peace lacked proper territorial certification, and that therefore the marriage itself was legally void, which would revert Evelyn to the status of an unmarried woman who had entered into a fraudulent domestic arrangement. If the marriage was voided, she had no legal standing on the ranch. And without legal standing on the ranch, Damien's next move became considerably easier. "When does the inquiry convene?" she asked. 3 weeks, the deputy said. He was looking at the fence line, not at her. "County seat." "Thank you," she said. He nodded, turned his horse, and left. He didn't look back. Evelyn stood at the gate with the document in her hands and the cold coming in off the range, and did the math on 3 weeks, and what Damien could build in 3 weeks, and what she and Boone had to work with, and how the numbers added up. They didn't add up well. "He found the justice of the peace," she said. "Or found something on him," Boone said. He took the document back and looked at it again, as if a second reading might change what it said. Old Harlan didn't exactly have a clean record. If someone went digging, Damien went digging. She turned and started walking back toward the house. "He has people for that, people who dig." Boone fell into step beside her. "We need a lawyer. We need a better lawyer than whoever Damien is using, and we need them in 3 weeks, and they need to know territorial marriage law." She stopped on the porch steps. "I know someone. In Cheyenne. He handled contract disputes for my father a long time ago. He knows Eastern law and territorial law both. If he's still practicing." "Write to him today." "I will." She looked at the document one more time, then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket with a kind of finality. "Boone, if the inquiry goes against us, it won't. But if it does, it won't," he said again, not with the heat of someone trying to convince her, but with the flat steadiness of someone stating a position they've already settled on and don't intend to revisit. She looked at him for a moment. "You can't just will things into being true," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I can make sure we've done everything possible to make them true, and then I stop worrying about the alternative." She didn't have an argument for that. She went inside and wrote the letter to Cheyenne. The article ran in Garrett Cole's paper that Wednesday. It was 4 columns, front page, which was more real estate than Cole gave anything except the occasional catastrophic weather event. The headline was plain: "Eastern businessman's claims against local rancher's wife draw scrutiny." Understated, but Cole knew his readership. A screaming headline would put people's backs up before they even started reading. The article laid out the situation with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that the facts, arranged properly, made the argument without editorializing. It quoted from 2 of Damien's letters, the portions that showed, in his own language, his belief that Evelyn was a possession to be reclaimed rather than a person making her own decisions. It noted the water rights challenge and its procedural suspension. It noted the marriage inquiry. It quoted Evelyn directly. "I left of my own free will, in full possession of my faculties, for reasons I am prepared to document. I am a married woman operating a working ranch in this county, and I intend to remain so." It quoted Boone as well, which surprised her, because she hadn't known Cole had spoken to him separately. The quote was short. "She's my wife, and this is her home. That's the end of it." Cole had also, with the instinct of a man who knew how to bury the most important thing where it would be found by the right reader, included a single paragraph near the end noting that Mr. Ashford had recently met with 3 territorial officials, one of whom had received a substantial land grant in his district under circumstances that the territorial governor's office had previously flagged for review. That paragraph was going to cause problems for Damien that extended well beyond Red Hollow Creek. Evelyn read it twice to make sure she understood what Cole had done, and then she went to his office. "That last paragraph," she said. Cole was at his desk, making notes on something. He looked up with the mildly distracted expression of a man interrupted mid-thought. "What about it?" "You've been sitting on that information. I've been waiting for the right moment to use it. You used it now." Now seemed right. He set his pen down. "Ashford made a mistake. He's been operating in this territory like it's the eastern seaboard, like money and connections close every door. They don't, out here. People talk, and some of the people he's been meeting with have histories that don't survive scrutiny." He looked at her steadily. "He also underestimated you. Most people do. Most people see a woman who arrived on a stagecoach with one bag and assume the bag is all there is." He picked his pen back up. "I make my living assuming there's more. Usually I'm right." She thanked him and left. On the street outside, she passed 2 men she half recognized from town who were standing with a copy of the paper between them, reading. She didn't stop, but she heard one of them say as she passed, "Didn't know Ashford had connections to Hartwell. That's a bad business." She kept walking. The article did not fix everything. She hadn't expected it to. What it did was shift the texture of the town's attention, from the vague discomfort of watching something unfamiliar to something more pointed, more aware. People who had been politely distant started nodding at her on the street. Mrs. Paulson at the dry goods store said, unprompted, "Read Cole's piece. Quite something." The woman who ran the laundry, a formidable person named Dora Fitch, who had opinions she shared freely, stopped Evelyn outside the post office and said, "That man has got some nerve coming out here and pulling this kind of business. My first husband was that type. I know the smell of it." "What did you do?" Evelyn asked. "Outlasted him," Dora said, with a satisfaction that had aged well. "They always think they can wear you down. They can't if you don't let them." Not everyone was moved. Reverend Finch wrote a letter to Cole's paper that appeared the following Friday, carefully phrased but pointed in its implication that the disruption to Red Hollow Creek's civic peace was attributable to the introduction of unvetted outsiders with murky pasts. Mrs. Helena Marsh, who Evelyn had come to understand was attached to Damien's cause less from genuine conviction than from the pleasure of being on what she perceived as the elevated side of a conflict, let it be known at the Women's Society meeting that the whole affair was typical of what happened when proper standards of courtship were abandoned. And then, on a Tuesday night in the second week of December, the barn burned. Evelyn woke to the smell. Not the sight. She'd had her window closed against the cold and the curtains drawn, so there was nothing to see at first. Just the smell, which reached her even through the walls. The particular smell of burning wood that is different from a wood stove or a campfire, that has a volume and a heat to it that the other kinds don't. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, into her boots and coat in a movement that was almost a single motion, down the stairs. Boone was already gone. She could tell by the open front door and the blast of cold air, and the orange glow that was coming from the direction of the barn. She ran. The barn was fully engaged by the time she got there. Not a small fire that caught on something dry, but a deliberate established burn, 2 walls involved, and the roof beginning to show through in places. The horses were screaming inside. That sound. She had never heard horses in that kind of panic before, and it went through her in a way she didn't have language for, immediate and physical. Boone was already at the barn door, which had warped in the heat and wasn't opening cleanly. He had his shoulder into it. Curtis was there too, materializing out of the dark in his boots and long underwear, and together they forced the door open and the smoke came out in a rush, and the screaming got louder. "Stay back," Boone said, not looking at her, and went in. She did not stay back. She wasn't built for staying back, had never been. She pulled her coat over her nose and went in behind Curtis, and the first horse was right there. Trouble, the difficult bay mare, who was wild-eyed and pulling against her lead and throwing her head in that way she had of making everything harder than it needed to be even under normal circumstances. Evelyn grabbed the lead with both hands and pulled. "Come on," she said, coughing. Come on, you stubborn animal, move! Trouble moved. Not cooperatively, not gracefully. She nearly knocked Evelyn sideways twice on the way out. But she moved, and they came out into the cold night air, and the mare's hooves hit the frozen ground, and she bolted for the far end of the pasture as if she intended to keep going all the way to Nebraska. Evelyn went back in. She couldn't see clearly. The smoke was bad enough that her eyes were streaming, and she was navigating by sound and memory and the orange light that was moving along the roof beams above her in a way that meant the roof wasn't going to hold long. She found the second horse, a gray gelding named Walt, who was, in ordinary circumstances, the calmest animal on the property, standing frozen in his stall with his eyes showing white all the way around. "Walt," she said, "Walt here." She got his lead. He resisted for one awful moment, planted completely, and she thought, I cannot move this animal by myself. And then something shifted in him, some animal decision she couldn't explain. And he went. They got all 4 horses out. She didn't know exactly how. It was a sequence of trips and heat and smoke and confusion, and at some point Pete appeared from the bunkhouse and took over with the last horse while Evelyn bent double in the yard coughing. She straightened up and looked at the barn. The roof came down in the middle section with a sound like something large giving up. Sparks went up into the night sky in a column, orange against the black, and then the wind took them sideways and Evelyn's heart seized before they went out. "The house," she said. "The sparks. Wind's going the wrong way," Curtis said beside her. He was wheezing badly. "Goes north, not south? House is south." "It's all right." She watched the barn burn. Boone came to stand beside her. She could hear him breathing harder than usual, which for Boone was a significant indicator of what the last 20 minutes had actually cost him. There was a burn on his left forearm. She could see it when he moved, the sleeve pushed back, a red stripe across the skin. "Your arm," she said. "I know." "Boone, I know, Evelyn." His voice was ragged but controlled. "We got them all out." "Yes." They stood and watched what was left of the barn finish going down. Curtis had a hand on Pete's shoulder. The young man was shaking, though whether from cold or aftermath she couldn't tell. The horses were somewhere in the far dark of the pasture, moving around each other in the restless way frightened animals do when the fear is still in them, but the immediate danger has passed. "It was set," Boone said. Not loud, just stating it. "Yes," she said. She'd known it when she first smelled the smoke. The pattern of the burn was wrong for an accident, too fast, too widespread, starting in 2 places at once the way fires don't start unless something helps them. She'd known it, and she'd pushed the knowledge down to deal with later because there was a more immediate problem. Now it was later. "His men," she said. "Most likely." Boone didn't move his eyes from the barn. "Can't prove it." "No." She pulled her coat tighter. The cold was returning now that the heat source was collapsing. "That's the point. He doesn't do things that can be proven. He made a mistake." She looked at him. "He went after the horses," Boone said. His voice was quiet and completely flat in the way she'd learned was the most dangerous register he had. "You don't go after a man's horses in this territory and keep the sympathy of the people around you. He doesn't know that. He thinks it's like Boston, that what's dramatic gets people frightened and compliant." He looked at her finally. "Out here it gets them angry." She thought about that. "Curtis," Boone said. "Yeah. In the morning, ride into town. Don't say anything about how it started. Just let people come and see." Curtis understood. All right. They came. Not a flood of people. This was not a sentimental town, and these were not sentimental people. But they came steadily through the following day in 1s and 2s the way people come when something real has happened, and they want to see it for themselves. Ranchers who had never had occasion to speak to Boone directly. The man who ran the feed store. 2 of the women from the laundry. Dora Fitch, who walked the perimeter of what was left of the barn in her coat and her hat with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "This was deliberate." "The investigation's ongoing," Evelyn said carefully. "I grew up on a ranch. I know what a barn fire looks like, and I know what this looks like." Dora looked at her. "That man is still at the hotel?" "As far as I know." Dora made a sound that was not a word but communicated clearly anyway. She spoke to 3 people on her way back into town. Evelyn didn't know exactly what she said, but by the following morning, the sheriff, the actual town sheriff, a man named Arlo Briggs, who had been carefully neutral through everything, came out to the ranch to look at the burn site. Briggs was a practical man in his late 50s who'd been sheriff of Red Hollow Creek for 11 years and had survived that long by understanding which conflicts were political and which were real. He walked the burn site the same way Dora had, slowly, systematically, reading what was there. When he was done, he said to Boone, "I can't bring charges without direct evidence." "I know," Boone said, "but I can ask some questions." He looked at the wreckage. "Those are expensive horses to put at risk, all 4 of them." "Yes," Boone said. Briggs looked at him. "Expensive and difficult to replace." "Very." The sheriff nodded, put his hat back on, and rode back into town. Boone watched him go. Evelyn came to stand beside him. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means he's going to go have a conversation with Damien that isn't on any official record," Boone said. "And it means Damien is about to find out that the rules here are not exactly what he thought they were." She absorbed that. "Will it stop him?" "No," Boone said honestly, "but it'll slow him down, and it'll tell us what he does next." What Damien did next arrived in the mail 2 days later. A formal notice from the territorial magistrate's office that the marriage inquiry had been expedited and moved up to the following week, and that in light of ongoing concerns about Mrs. Mercer's welfare and mental competency, a preliminary assessment would be required before the inquiry convened. Mental competency. She read the phrase 3 times. Then she put the notice down on the kitchen table very carefully, the way you put something down when your hands are not entirely steady and you don't want anyone to see them shaking. The fire had done its work after all. Not the way Damien had intended. It hadn't broken them, hadn't sent her running back to Boston, but it had accelerated his timeline, pushed him into moves he'd have been more patient about otherwise. The barn burning had made him look bad, and looking bad made him impatient, and impatient men with money and legal connections reach for the biggest tools they have. Mental competency was the biggest tool he had left. "He's going to try to have me declared incompetent," she said, when Boone came in from the range that evening. He read the notice. She watched his face. "Before the inquiry," he said, "if he can have me assessed and declared incompetent, the marriage inquiry becomes irrelevant. A woman declared mentally unfit can't enter into a legal marriage. Everything unravels. Who does the assessment? Whoever the magistrate appoints." She looked at the notice. "Which means whoever Damien can get the magistrate to appoint." Boone set the notice down and sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. She could see him thinking. Not the quick surface thinking of someone responding to the immediate situation, but the slower, deeper kind, going through options and angles, and what each one cost. "Cheyenne," he said. "What?" "Your lawyer in Cheyenne. Can he challenge the appointment of the assessor?" She thought. "He might be able to file a motion, but the timeline? How fast can he move?" "I don't know. Fast if I tell him fast." "Then tell him fast." Boone looked up at her. "And write to that friend of yours, Margaret." She went still. "Why?" "Because if Damien is going to make this about your mental state, we need people who know you, who knew you before, saying something on the record about who you actually are." His jaw was set. "And because if she's in trouble, she needs to know we're fighting back." Something moved through Evelyn then that she didn't have a clean name for. Gratitude was part of it, but that word was too small. She'd been trying not to think about Margaret for weeks, packing the worry down under everything else because she couldn't afford it, couldn't let herself go to that place. Boone had thought of it because he was paying attention, because he'd listened that night by the fire when she'd said Margaret's name and he'd kept it. "All right," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "I'll write to her." She sat down at the table across from him, pulled paper and pen toward herself, and started writing. Boone got up and built the fire higher against the cold that was coming in through the walls. And then he sat back down and went through the ranch accounts with the same steady attention he always brought to them, as if the world outside was not systematically working to dismantle everything they'd built. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved across the open land in long waves. The horses, sheltered now in the temporary structure Curtis and Pete had built from salvaged timber in the 2 days after the fire, were quiet. She finished the letter to Margaret, then the one to the lawyer in Cheyenne. Then she folded both, sealed them, and set them by the door to go out with the morning. "Boone," she said, He looked up. He's going to come at us with everything he has left. When this next move doesn't work, and it won't work, he's going to be out of patient approaches. What's left after that isn't going to look clean. Boone held her gaze. I know. I want to make sure you know what you're in for. Evelyn. He said her name the way he said things he'd already decided. I knew what I was in for when I read your first letter, and I could tell you were running, and I answered it anyway. He looked back at the accounts. Nothing that's happened since has changed my thinking. She sat with that. Outside, the wind kept moving. The fire kept burning. The barn was ashes, and the legal ground under their feet was eroding, and a man with significant money was working every angle he had to take apart the life they'd spent 2 months building. And somehow, sitting in that cold kitchen with the lamp between them and the letters by the door and the sound of the horses settling in for the night, it did not feel like losing. It felt like the moment before the real fight starts, when you've already decided you're not going anywhere, and all that's left is to hold the line. The lawyer from Cheyenne arrived on a Thursday, 2 days before the expedited inquiry was scheduled to convene, and his name was Edmund Voss. He was 63 years old, short, built like a man who'd once been solid and had redistributed over the decades, and he had the unhurried precision of someone who had been in more courtrooms than he could accurately count and had stopped being impressed by opposing counsel approximately 30 years ago. He came straight to the ranch from the stage, which Evelyn appreciated. He didn't go to the hotel first to establish himself, or take a meal, or do any of the things that men who wanted to be seen arriving tended to do. He came to the ranch, sat at the kitchen table, accepted coffee, and opened his case. The motion to challenge the assessor appointment was filed Monday, he said, pulling papers out with the efficient movements of long practice. The magistrate denied it Wednesday. Evelyn had expected this. On what grounds? Expediency. The expedited timeline doesn't allow for the standard challenge period. Voss found the paper he was looking for and set it on the table, which tells us the expedited timeline was not accidental. He bought the expedited timeline, Boone said. Almost certainly, which we cannot prove, but which I've noted in the record in terms that make the implication clear. Voss looked at both of them over the rim of his glasses. The assessor is a physician named Dr. Clement Farrow, out of Laramie. He has testified in 3 previous competency proceedings in this territory. He found against the subject in all 3. Who were the subjects? Evelyn asked. 2 women contesting inheritance claims. 1 man who disputed a business partner's land acquisition. He let that sit for a moment. There is a pattern. I've documented it. Can you use it? I can use it to challenge the weight given to his assessment in the inquiry record. I cannot prevent him from conducting the assessment. He looked at her directly. He'll come tomorrow morning. I want you to understand what that conversation is going to be like. Tell me. He'll be pleasant. He'll ask you about your history, your state of mind, your reasons for leaving Boston, your current domestic circumstances. The questions will seem like conversation. They're not. He's building a record of responses that can be characterized as evidence of instability. The answers themselves almost don't matter. It's how they're framed afterward that does the work. What do I do? Answer everything plainly. Short sentences, direct responses. Don't volunteer information he hasn't asked for. Don't explain yourself beyond what's necessary. Voss picked up his coffee. And don't let him make you angry. That's what he's counting on. An angry woman becomes an unstable woman in a written report. She nodded. She'd dealt with enough men like Damien to understand the mechanics. The way a system that was built to disadvantage you counted on you not knowing it was doing so. The advantage she had was that she knew. What about the marriage inquiry itself? Boone asked. Justice of the peace. Harlan's certification lapsed 14 months ago. Ashford found it, which took real digging. It wasn't public knowledge. Voss set down his cup. However, a lapsed certification doesn't automatically void ceremonies performed during the lapsed period. There is territorial precedent for the marriage standing provided both parties affirm its validity and there was no deliberate fraud in the ceremony. We both affirm it, Boone said flatly. I know, but Ashford's argument will be that Callahan knew about the lapsed certification and concealed it, which constitutes fraud. Do you know whether Harlan's certification was current when you engaged him? Boone looked at him. I knew Harlan had done ceremonies for 20 years. I didn't examine his paperwork. That's honest, and it's also the right answer. Voss made a note. I can argue good faith on your part. I can argue the burden of verification lay with the certifying body, not the contracting party. It's defensible. He paused. It's not airtight. What is airtight? Evelyn asked. Voss looked at her for a moment. Additional documentation of the marriage's legitimacy. Witnesses who can speak to the ceremony and the ongoing domestic arrangement. Evidence of financial commingling, joint accounts, contracts signed jointly, property operating under both names. We have some of that, she said. The Casper cattle contract is under both names. The ranch accounts, I've been running since November. Good. Bring everything. He looked at his notes. I also want to speak with your ranch hands, the newspaper editor, and anyone else in this town who has had regular contact with you since your arrival. I need a picture of who you are in this community that is separate from anything Ashford can characterize. That'll be a short list, Boone said. It doesn't need to be long, it needs to be credible. Dr. Clement Farrow arrived the following morning at 9, and he was exactly what Voss had described, pleasant in the professional surface manner of a man who had learned to put people at ease as a technique rather than an instinct. He was well-dressed, mild-featured, and he had a way of listening with his head slightly tilted that was meant to convey sympathetic attention and actually conveyed to Evelyn the specific attention of a man looking for something to use. Voss sat in the corner of the room during the assessment, which was his legal right, and which Farrow had clearly hoped to avoid. The physician's eyes had gone to him when he entered, and Voss had simply nodded and taken his chair and opened his notebook, and that had been that. Farrow asked her about Providence, about her family, about her father's financial difficulties, and how those had affected her as a young woman, about her relationship with Damien, carefully phrased, very careful, she noticed. He said your previous engagement, and not your flight from your previous engagement, and her reasons for leaving. She answered everything in the plain, short sentences Voss had told her to use. When Farrow asked about her mental state during the journey west, she said she'd been frightened and determined, both of which were true. When he asked about her adjustment to frontier life, she described the specifics: the fence repair, the account books, the cattle contract, learning to ride. And you feel settled here? Farrow asked. His pen was moving. I feel that I'm building something here that I intend to continue building, she said, with a man you'd known only through correspondence before your arrival. With my husband, she said. Yes. Some might find that arrangement, he paused, selecting, unconventional. Some might. She met his eyes. I find it honest. We both knew what we were entering into. We've both kept our commitments, she paused. Is unconventional the same as unstable, Dr. Farrow? I'd like to know because I think that question is at the center of what you're actually being asked to determine. A brief silence. Voss in his corner did not look up from his notebook. Farrow smiled. I appreciate your candor. I appreciate yours, she said. He left an hour later with his notes and his assessment to be written in Laramie and his pleasant manner intact. She stood on the porch and watched him go and then went inside and sat at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands for approximately 30 seconds. Then she straightened up. How did that go? Boone said from the doorway. I don't know, she said honestly. Better than he wanted, not as well as I'd like. Voss came through from the sitting room, already putting his coat on. You did well, he said, which from him sounded less like reassurance and more like a technical assessment. He didn't get the anger he was looking for. The responses were consistent and specific. Specific is important. Unstable people tend toward vague. He picked up his case. The inquiry is tomorrow. Get some sleep. He left for the hotel. Boone closed the door. I want to go into town this afternoon, Evelyn said. He looked at her. I want to talk to people, she said. Not for the inquiry, just... She stopped. Cole's article moved something in this town. I can feel it. But feeling it isn't the same as having it, and tomorrow I'm going to stand in front of a magistrate who has been paid for and a physician's assessment that was probably written before he even got on the coach out here, and I need to know who's actually with us. Boone was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. I'll come with you. You don't? I know I don't. He picked up his hat. Stop saying that. What happened in Red Hollow Creek that afternoon was not a coordinated thing. It wasn't a plan. It was more like... She thought about it afterward, trying to find the right way to describe it. The way water finds its level. The town had been holding its collective breath for 3 weeks, watching the pressure build, waiting to see which way it was going to break. And when Evelyn walked down the main street of Red Hollow Creek with her husband at her side and stopped to talk to people, really talk to them, something shifted that had been waiting to shift. She went into the dry goods store, and Mrs. Paulson said without being asked, "The inquiry's tomorrow." "Yes." "I'd like to come." The older woman said it simply, the way she might say she'd like an extra pound of flour. "If witnesses are allowed." "They're allowed," Evelyn said, and something tightened in her chest. She went to Cole's office, and he told her he was planning to cover the inquiry and had already sent a correspondence notice to 2 papers in Cheyenne, which meant whatever happened would be on a record that extended beyond the territory's local politics. She went to the sheriff's office, and Arlo Briggs told her, with the careful language of a man being precise, that he'd completed his investigation of the barn fire, and while no charges had been filed, he had noted in his official report that the pattern of the burn was inconsistent with accidental origin. "Is that in the official record?" Voss asked when she reported back. He'd appeared at the ranch again by late afternoon. He said it was. "Good. I can introduce it." Voss almost smiled. "The sheriff is a careful man." "He is," she said. What she hadn't expected, what surprised her, genuinely, in the way that things surprise you when you've been braced for a fight and the landscape shifts around the fight without warning, was Dora Fitch coming to the ranch at 6 in the evening with 4 other women, 2 of whom Evelyn had never spoken to directly. They came in the wagon, came to the front door, and Dora said, "We want to be there tomorrow, the 5 of us. We've talked it over." Evelyn stood in the doorway looking at them. "Why?" Dora looked back at her with the direct, unfancy gaze of a woman who didn't see the point in wrapping things. "Because we've all known men like the one that's after you, maybe not rich like him, but the same in the ways that matter. And most of us didn't have anyone show up to stand next to us when it counted." She paused. "You've got someone, but more isn't worse." Evelyn didn't have an immediate response to that. Boone, somewhere behind her, was quiet. "Come in," she said finally. "I'll put on coffee." The inquiry convened at 10 in the morning in the county office, which was a room built for administrative business and not for the number of people who arrived to stand against the walls when it turned out there weren't enough chairs. The magistrate was a man named Hartwell, not the same Hartwell that Cole had named in his article, but related, which Voss had noted and flagged formally at the outset as a potential conflict of interest, a motion that was denied but was now in the record, which was what Voss cared about. The magistrate was in his 50s with the cultivated neutrality of a man who'd learned to give nothing away from the bench, but his eyes had gone to the crowd at the back of the room when he came in, and something in them had shifted. Damien was present. He sat at the opposing table with his lawyer and 2 other men who had the look of people who expected to be obeyed, and he was dressed impeccably and composed in the way he was always composed. And when Evelyn came in, he looked at her with the warm, concerned expression that she had once, long ago, believed was real. She looked at him and felt nothing except a clear, cold clarity about what was happening and what she intended to do about it. Voss opened with the conflict of interest motion, argued it efficiently, and moved immediately to the question of the assessor's history. He put Dr. Farrow's 3 previous assessments on the record with their outcomes and the names of the parties who had commissioned them. The pattern was there in plain language. Farrow, seated near the side wall, kept his pleasant expression with visible effort. Damien's lawyer objected. Hartwell allowed the material into the record. Then the witnesses. Mrs. Paulson, who had run a business in Red Hollow Creek for 22 years and had the credibility of that tenure, in every word she said, described Evelyn as organized, direct, and fully capable of managing complex transactions. She mentioned the account books and the supplier negotiations and the fact that the Callahan Ranch had turned a profit in November for the first time in 2 years. Curtis testified to the fence work and the horsemanship and the way she'd gone into the burning barn. He said it the way Curtis said everything, without drama, just flat and true, and the absence of performance made it land harder than embellishment would have. "She went in twice," he said. "The second time the roof was already starting to go. I wasn't going back in." "She did." Cole presented his records, the letters, the bribes documented in the official territorial correspondence he'd obtained through a source he didn't name, the connection between the water rights challenge and Damien's meetings with appointed officials. The sheriff's report went in. The barn fires documented irregularities, the pattern of targeted legal actions all originating from a single source. Damien's lawyer cross-examined each witness with the polished aggression of someone very good at his job. He made Mrs. Paulson seem like she was speaking from limited acquaintance. He made Curtis's barn account seem like loyalty rather than fact. He challenged Cole's documentation sourcing. None of it fully worked because Voss re-examined after each cross and the structure held. And then Damien did something Evelyn had not predicted. He took the stand himself. She hadn't expected it. Voss hadn't either. She saw the small adjustment in his posture, the quick recalibration of a man reorganizing. Damien's lawyer was watching his client with the expression of someone whose client has just done something they hadn't discussed. But Damien was calm. He was always calm when he chose to perform it. He spoke about Evelyn with a grief that sounded genuine from 10 feet away, about their years together, about his concern for her well-being, about the manner of her leaving, the note, the absence, the fear he'd felt not knowing where she'd gone. He described a woman he loved deeply, who had been under enormous strain, who had made a frightened choice that he didn't blame her for, but that he couldn't in good conscience leave unaddressed. It was a good performance. She'd give him that. Some of the people standing against the wall shifted slightly, not to his side, but away from the certainty they'd arrived with, which was probably what he'd intended. Then Voss stood and said, "Mr. Ashford, you've described at some length your concern for Mrs. Callahan's welfare. I'd like to direct the record to Exhibit 7, which is a letter written by you to Mrs. Callahan, dated October 14th of this year." He read the relevant portion aloud. It was the section from the letter she'd received in November. The part that said, in Damien's own careful, pleasant handwriting, "I will have men in Red Hollow Creek by the end of the month. They will be there to assist you in whatever way you require." "Mr. Ashford," Voss said, "can you describe for the record what was meant by whatever way you require?" A pause. "I meant support," Damien said. "Assistance in returning. You sent men to a territory where a woman had explicitly indicated she did not wish to be found, without her consent, with instructions that were contingent on what she required, requirements you would be determining on her behalf." Voss's voice was entirely level. "Is that an accurate characterization?" "That's not. Did you consult Mrs. Callahan before sending those men?" "She wasn't in a position to—" "A simple yes or no, Mr. Ashford." The room was very quiet. "No," Damien said. "No." Voss turned back to his table. "Nothing further." What happened then was not dramatic in any single moment. There was no gasp from the gallery, no visible collapse. Damien sat with the composed expression he'd maintained through the entire proceeding and said nothing further and waited for the session to resume. But the room had changed. Evelyn could feel it, the particular temperature shift of a space full of people who have just reorganized their understanding of something. The women along the wall, the ranchers and merchants who'd come to watch, the sheriff, standing near the door with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Magistrate Hartwell called a recess. In the hallway, Evelyn stood with Boone and Voss and didn't speak for a moment. Down the hall, she could see Damien's lawyer talking to him in a low, urgent voice, and Damien listening with the expression of a man who is processing having miscalculated. "The whatever way you require line," she said to Voss. "He wrote it thinking it would never be read aloud in a public proceeding," Voss said. "That's the problem with men who are accustomed to controlling the context. They forget that context can change." "How does it look?" Boone asked. Voss considered. "Better than this morning," he said, which from Voss was practically jubilant. She leaned against the wall and looked down the hallway at Damien, who was still listening to his lawyer, and she thought about the first time she'd heard his voice, at a dinner party in Providence when she'd been 22 and had understood approximately nothing about how the world actually worked. She thought about the slow years after, the room getting smaller. Then she thought about the train west, the coach from Cheyenne, standing in the dirt street of Red Hollow Creek with her suitcase and looking at this town, and thinking far and different and not yet knowing whether those things were the same as safe. They weren't the same. She understood that now. Safe wasn't a place you arrived at. It was something you built, badly and imperfectly, and with a lot of help from people you hadn't expected to need. Boone was beside her, looking down the hall. He wasn't touching her. That wasn't how he operated in public. Probably wasn't how he operated anywhere unless it was needed. But he was there, specifically and deliberately there, which she'd come to understand was how he showed most things. "Hey," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you." She said it simply, without ceremony, because he was not a man who did well with ceremony. For the letter, for opening the door, for all of it. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that she had once thought were cold and now understood were just private. "You'd have found another way out," he said. "Maybe." She looked at her hands. "But I found this way, and this way has been, despite everything, it's been better than I knew to ask for." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Yeah." His voice was rougher than usual. "For me too." Voss reappeared from wherever he'd been. "They're reconvening," he said. They went back in. When Magistrate Hartwell read his preliminary ruling 40 minutes later, it was in the measured language of a bureaucrat who has decided which way the evidence points, and is choosing his words carefully in case they are later reviewed by a higher authority. The competency assessment, he ruled, was insufficient as submitted. The assessor's documented history of partial findings warranted a second independent assessment before any determination could be made. The marriage inquiry, he ruled, could not be resolved on the current record, as the question of fraudulent intent required additional investigation that the expedited timeline had not allowed. All proceedings were suspended pending that investigation, which would be conducted by an officer of the territorial court unconnected to any party in the dispute. It was not a victory. Voss had told her going in not to expect a clean victory, because clean victories in legal proceedings were rare enough to be suspicious. What it was a stay, a pause, a door pushed open rather than thrown wide. But Damien's legal construct had been publicly examined and found wanting, and the man himself had been asked a direct question in a room full of people and had given an answer that revealed something he'd intended to keep concealed. And those things, once they were in the public record and in Cole's notes, and in the memory of everyone standing along those walls, could not be taken back. She stood outside the county office in the cold December air, and the sky was doing something extraordinary. One of those Wyoming winter skies that are too big to process, blue going gray at the edges with clouds that were probably snow by tonight. And Dora Fitch came to stand beside her. "Not over," Dora said. "No," Evelyn agreed. "But better." "Yes." Dora looked across the street where Damien had emerged from the building with his lawyer and his two associates and was walking toward the hotel with his usual composed, unhurried gait. "He's not used to losing things," she said. "No. Men like that, when they lose, they either go away or they do something stupid." Dora pulled her coat tighter. "Either way, it's closer to the end than the beginning." Evelyn watched Damien's back until he turned the corner. She thought about what Boone had said after the fire. Out here, it gets them angry. She thought about the room today, how it had felt, how many people had come, and what it meant that they had. She had arrived in this town with nothing and no one, and the desperate energy of someone running hard from something. She had not expected to find anything worth stopping for. She hadn't stopped running exactly, she thought. She'd just turned around. And turned out, the ground she was standing on was worth standing on. Boone came up beside her. "Voss wants to talk through the next steps." "I know." She pulled her coat closed and turned away from the corner where Damien had disappeared. "Let's go." The snow came that night, the way Evelyn had learned Wyoming snow comes, not gradually, not with warning, just suddenly there, covering everything with the indifferent efficiency of a land that doesn't ask permission before it changes. She lay awake listening to it settle against the windows and thought about Dora Fitch's words. Either they go away, or they do something stupid. She had been in Red Hollow Creek long enough to know which one Damien would do. He was not a man built for retreat. Retreat required a certain honesty about loss that men like him were structurally incapable of. What he was built for was escalation dressed as reasonableness, pressure that arrived with a smile, the final move that he'd been holding in reserve the whole time. And she'd been waiting for it since the inquiry, watching the hotel, watching the street, watching for the particular shift in the air that preceded his worst decisions. It came on a Saturday morning, 10 days after the inquiry. Wiry. She was in the barn, the temporary structure still smelling of fresh-cut timber and sawdust, when she heard the horses on the road, not one horse, not two. Several, moving together at a pace that was faster than the road out to the ranch normally warranted in December. She came out of the barn and saw them. 4 riders she didn't recognize, and behind them, Damien's hired carriage, moving through the snow with the determined progress of something that had already decided the outcome. Curtis appeared from the other side of the yard. Pete came out of the bunkhouse. They'd all heard it. Boone came out of the house. He stood on the porch without his coat. He'd come out fast, hadn't grabbed it, with his arms at his sides and the particular stillness he had when he was at his most dangerous, and he looked at the approaching riders and said nothing. Damien stepped out of the carriage when it stopped at the gate. He was carrying papers. Behind him, 2 of the riders dismounted, and Evelyn could see now that one of them had a badge, a county deputy she hadn't seen before, not Briggs, someone new. "Mr. Callahan," Damien said. His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. "I have a court order, a valid one this time, from a circuit court judge out of Laramie, not a territorial magistrate who can be argued with." He held up the papers. "It mandates Mrs. Mercer's immediate—" "Callahan," Evelyn said from the yard. She'd walked forward without deciding to, just found herself moving, between Damien and the porch, standing in the snow in her work clothes with her hands loose at her sides. "My name is Evelyn Callahan." Damien looked at her. The pleasant expression was still there. But underneath it, this close, she could see what 3 weeks of losing small battles had done to him. The tightness around his eyes, the effort it was taking. "Evelyn, this order is legitimate. The judge is unimpeachable. There's nothing your lawyer can do with a motion this time." "Let me see it," she said. He looked faintly surprised. He'd expected her to step back. She had never, not once in all the years she'd known him, stood her ground in the first 10 seconds. She held out her hand. He gave her the papers. She read them. They were real. The formatting, the seal, the signature. A circuit court judge named Abrams out of Laramie. She didn't recognize the name, which didn't mean anything, and did know that Voss had told her Damien had 2 judges in his network, and one of them was in Laramie, which meant everything. She lowered the papers. "The order cites the pending competency determination," she said, "but the magistrate suspended that proceeding pending independent investigation. The circuit court has jurisdiction over the magistrate's court," Damien said. "The suspension is superseded." "That's not correct procedure," she said. "My lawyer assures me it is." "Your lawyer is wrong." She looked at the deputy. "Who are you?" The deputy had the expression of a man who'd arrived expecting simple work and was recalibrating. "Deputy Crane, out of the Laramie district. Have you verified this order against the current status of the underlying proceedings?" A pause. "I was given the order and asked to execute it." "So no," she said. She turned to the riders. "You're hired men, not officers." None of them answered, which was an answer. She turned back to Damien. And here was the thing that she had not known about herself. Before Red Hollow Creek, before the fence work and the account books and the freezing pre-dawn mornings and the burning barn and the inquiry room, before Boone's gray eyes telling her plainly that she was not going to be handed over, that this was her home, that 2 people who needed something solid could give each other that. She had not known that she was the kind of person who could stand in the snow in front of a man who had systematically dismantled her life for 4 years and look at him without flinching. Who could hold his papers and hand them back and say what she said next. "Damien," she said, quietly enough that only he could clearly hear it, "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave this property. Not because I'm frightened of you, because I think somewhere underneath all of this, you know that what you're doing is wrong, and I'd rather you choose to stop than be made to stop." Something moved across his face. Not the performance, not the mask. Something real, brief, and uncomfortable. Then it was gone. "I'm not leaving without you," he said. "Then we have a problem," she said, and stepped back. Because coming down the road behind the carriage, she could now see other horses, and a wagon, and then another wagon. Sheriff Arlo Briggs rode in front, unhurried, and behind him came, not an organized group, not a planned confrontation, but the same organic, water-finding its level thing that had been building in Red Hollow Creek for weeks. Cole was there, with his notebook. Dora Fitch was in one of the wagons. Mrs. Paulson, 2 of the ranchers who'd come to look at the burn site, the merchant who'd been skeptical, the woman from the laundry. 17, 18 people, maybe more, coming up the road through the snow to the Callahan Ranch on a Saturday morning because word traveled fast in a small town, and what Deputy Crane hadn't understood when he'd ridden through asking directions was that the directions he'd been given had been given slowly, on purpose, by people who'd already sent someone ahead. Briggs pulled up beside the carriage and looked at the order in Evelyn's hands. "Morning," he said, not to any one person specifically, to the situation. "Sheriff," Damien said, and his voice was still even, still controlled. "This proceeding is a county matter, not—" "I'm the county sheriff," Briggs said pleasantly. "So it's my matter." He looked at Deputy Crane. "You're out of jurisdiction, son. Laramie circuit orders don't execute in this county without my office's endorsement." Crane looked at the order. The judge said a lot of things. What the judge didn't do was contact my office, which is procedure. Briggs had the calm of a man who'd made his decision before he got on his horse that morning. You want to execute that order, you file it through my office. I review it. If it's valid, we proceed. If it's not, we don't. It'll take days. It'll take as long as it takes. He looked at Damien. "Mr. Ashford, you want to do this right? You go through proper channels. You want to do it wrong, you're going to have a problem." He gestured very mildly at the people arranged along the road and in the yard. A visible one. Damien looked at the assembled faces of Red Hollow Creek, Wyoming territory. Evelyn had seen him in a lot of situations. She'd seen him charm rooms and intimidate individuals and outmaneuver opponents who were smarter than him by virtue of being willing to go further. She had never seen him in a situation where money and lawyers and the machinery of established power ran into something it simply could not purchase. He stood in the snow looking at a town that had decided, collectively and without being organized into deciding, that it was not going to be bought. Not the sheriff, not the editor, not the women who'd watched their own versions of this story and come out on a cold Saturday because they remembered what it felt like to have nobody show up. Not the two ranch hands who were standing in the yard of a ranch they worked on for wages and had not been asked to stand there, but were standing there anyway. Not the man on the porch, coatless in December, who had not moved or spoken since Damien arrived, who was not performing readiness, but simply was ready, in the absolute way of someone who has decided and is waiting for the other party to catch up. Damien's jaw moved, just once. Then he got back in his carriage. His lawyer said something to him, low and urgent, and Damien said something back that Evelyn couldn't hear. The four riders remounted. Deputy Crane looked from the carriage to Briggs and back, recalculating his afternoon. "Deputy," Briggs said, "I'll buy you coffee at Ida's and walk you through the filing procedure." Crane, looking relieved to have been offered a way out of the situation that didn't require further decisions, nodded. The carriage turned. The riders fell in behind it, and Damien Ashford went back down the road through the snow, and the town of Red Hollow Creek watched him go. He left the territory 4 days later. Voss told them by letter, which arrived on a Wednesday. A letter with the particular satisfaction of a man who enjoys delivering good news almost as much as he enjoys constructing the conditions that make good news possible. The circuit court judge had been referred to the territorial governor's office for review of his conduct. Cole's article in Cheyenne had moved faster than expected, and 2 other parties who'd been affected by the judge's previous rulings had come forward, which meant the problem was bigger than Damien and was now someone else's problem to manage. The competency proceeding had been formally dropped when the appointed investigator determined there was no credible basis to continue it. The marriage was affirmed in full by the Territorial Recorder's Office, which had conducted its own review and found that Justice of the Peace Harlan's lapsed certification, while procedurally irregular, did not constitute grounds for invalidation given documented good faith conduct by both parties. Evelyn read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table. Then she handed it to Boone. He read it, set it down, picked up his coffee. "It's over," she said. Not a question, just the shape of the words needing to be said aloud to become real. "Looks like," he said. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the snow from the weekend had mostly gone, the way December snow in Wyoming often went. Dramatic arrival, brief occupation, quick departure. The range was brown and gray, and the sky was doing its enormous thing above it. And the temporary barn structure Curtis and Pete had built was still standing, slightly crooked at the southwest corner where Pete had miscalculated the post depth. "What do you want to do about the barn?" she asked. He looked at her. "The real one, when we rebuild." She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket. next to where Damien's first letter had lived for weeks. Different letters in the same pocket. The geometry of that felt significant in a way she didn't try to articulate. I was thinking we bring the east wall out 8 feet. Give more room for the horses. Trouble needs her own space or she makes the others miserable. Boone looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in his face. Not a performance of emotion, but the real thing, slightly awkward, the way real things are on a face that doesn't often show them. Yeah, he said, that makes sense. Curtis thinks we can have the frame up by March if we start the materials order now. Probably. And the Casper buyer wants to expand the contract. More head, better price per. It would mean more cattle through the summer, which means more work, which probably means another hand. I know. She looked at him. You're not saying much. I'm listening, he said. Boone. He set down his cup. What? Are you all right? She asked it the way he had once asked her, in the kitchen before Damien arrived, with the same quality of directness that wasn't intrusive but simply present. Are you all right? Not, are you fine? Not, are you managing? Are you actually all right? He was quiet for long enough that she counted it. Clara used to say I'd be alone my whole life if I didn't learn to let people in, he said. It was the most words he'd said about Clara in one breath since the night in the study. She thought it was funny, mostly, the way she said everything that was hard, like if you made it funny enough it was easier to hear. She sounds like she was right, Evelyn said. She was usually right. He looked at the table. I thought the right thing was to be alone, that I'd used up whatever chance I had at this kind of life, and the sensible thing was to manage what was left without asking for more than that. And now, he looked up at her, and now I have an 8-foot east wall to think about. She didn't smile exactly, but something in her chest did. That's not quite an answer, she said. No. He picked his cup back up. I'm all right, Evelyn. I'm more all right than I've been in a long time. I just don't have the vocabulary for it yet. That's honest, she said. I told you I'd be honest. You did. She got up and refilled the coffee, and they sat in the kitchen with the letter in her pocket and the future in the slightly crooked southwest corner of the temporary barn outside. And it wasn't comfortable exactly. It was two people still learning the language of being in something together, still finding the edges of what they were. But it was real. It had the weight of real things. A letter from Margaret arrived 3 weeks later. Evelyn was at the fence line when Curtis brought it out to her. He'd ridden out from town with the mail, and he handed it over without ceremony and went back to what he was doing, which was Curtis's particular grace. He understood the difference between things that needed bearing witness and things that needed privacy. She stood at the fence with the letter and the open range behind her, and her horse tied to the post beside her, and she opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. Margaret was in Philadelphia. She had left Boston in November, 2 weeks after Evelyn, with help from a cousin who'd been asking her to come for years. She was working. She was not in trouble. She had, in the precise language that Margaret always used, even in personal correspondence, because she'd been a bookkeeper for 15 years, and it had shaped her, conducted herself in a manner that left no legal vulnerabilities, which meant she'd been careful, and it had worked. She had gotten Evelyn's letter from Cheyenne. She'd waited to write back until she was somewhere safe enough that the letter's origin wouldn't give anything useful to anyone who might be looking. She was safe. At the bottom of the letter, in the same careful handwriting, I knew you'd find something worth staying for. You always did know quality when you saw it, even when you were too frightened to trust it. I hope Wyoming is everything Boston never was. Write back. Tell me everything. Evelyn stood at the fence line with the letter, and the wind came off the range in a long, cold wave, and she let it. She'd been holding that particular fear for 4 months, the fear about Margaret, the one she'd packed down under everything else because she couldn't afford it, couldn't let herself go to that place. She'd been holding it so long and so tightly that letting go of it felt almost physical, like releasing a breath she'd been taking in smaller and smaller increments without noticing. Margaret was safe. She folded the letter and put it in her coat and rode back to the ranch. She told Boone that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened, and when she finished he said, "Good," in the specific way he said things when the emotional weight was larger than the word, but he was choosing the word anyway because he wasn't built for the larger expression. She'd come to understand that about him. The words he used were always smaller than what he meant. You had to learn to read the margin around them. She wants me to write back, Evelyn said. Tell her everything. That'll be a long letter. Very. She was quiet for a moment. I told you, that night by the fire, that I was worried she'd paid a price for helping me. You did. And you told me to write to her anyway, when it counted. Yeah. She looked at him across the table. You're better at this than you think you are, she said. The letting people in part. He had the expression of a man receiving a compliment he doesn't know what to do with. Don't push it, he said. She smiled. Actually smiled, the full version, which happened more often now than it used to and still seemed to slightly unsettle him each time, like a sound he hadn't heard in a while and couldn't immediately place. Spring came late and hard to Red Hollow Creek, the way springs do in that part of Wyoming. A long argument between winter and the turning season that winter wins several times before finally conceding. But it came. By April, the range was showing green in patches, and by May the barn was framed and half-sided. The east wall extended 8 feet as planned. Trouble had her own space. She was, predictably, only marginally less difficult because of it, but marginally was an improvement. The Casper contract expanded. They hired a third hand, a quiet young man named Eli, who'd worked cattle in Texas and had come north looking for something steadier and turned out to be the most competent of the three, which Pete found humbling and Curtis found amusing. Garrett Cole ran 2 more articles, neither about the Callahans specifically, one about the circuit court judge's referral and its implications for territorial judicial accountability, one about the pattern of Eastern businessmen attempting to leverage territorial legal systems for personal ends. Both were picked up by papers in Cheyenne. The second one was reprinted, in part, by a paper in Denver. Cole told Evelyn this in the same mild, distracted way he told her everything, as if it were mildly interesting rather than significant. She understood that was how he protected himself from caring too much about his own work. She'd seen similar mechanisms in different forms. Damian Ashford did not return to the territory. She had expected for a while that the impatience that had driven him to increasingly bad decisions would drive him back for one more attempt. But the referral of the Laramie judge had apparently created problems in his business operations that required his full attention. And problems in his business operations were the one category of problem that could compete with his need to win a personal confrontation. She didn't feel relief about this exactly. She felt something more like the quiet that follows a long, sustained noise. The absence of a thing you've been bracing against for so long that you've stopped noticing the bracing. It took time to unknot those muscles. Some of them never fully did. That was something nobody told you about surviving the end of a long fear. The fear's departure didn't feel clean. It felt ragged and irregular. Good days and days when the sound of hooves on the road made her go still in a way she had to consciously manage. Boone noticed on those days, without commenting on it, he had his own version of the same thing, his own sounds that made him go somewhere private, his own irregular grief that had been living in the walls of the ranch for 7 years. They gave each other room for it, which was different from ignoring it and better than trying to fix it. Nobody fixed anything, in the end. You just got better at carrying what you carried. There was a morning in June, the 3rd summer of their marriage, when Evelyn was in the yard watching their daughter, 18 months old, named Ada, who had her mother's determination and her father's absolute stubbornness, which was a combination that suggested interesting years ahead. Navigate the considerable challenge of crossing the yard toward the fence where the horses were. Ada had decided she wanted to reach the fence. Ada had not yet achieved reliable walking on flat surfaces, but she had opinions about that limitation. She fell twice. Got up both times with the expression of someone who finds falling personally offensive and intends to address the structural problem causing it. Made it to the fence. Wrapped both small hands around the lowest rail and looked at the horses with the satisfied expression of someone who has arrived. Evelyn watched this from 10 feet away with the feeling that she did not have clean language for and had stopped trying to name. Boone came out of the house behind her. She heard him before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his boots on the porch boards that she could identify now with her eyes closed. He came to stand beside her. They watched Ada examine the fence rail with great seriousness. "She's going to want to ride by the end of the summer," Evelyn said. "She's 18 months old. She watched Pete ride out yesterday and pointed at the horse for 10 minutes. She points at everything." She pointed at the horse differently. She looked at him. You know she's going to be a problem. I know, he said, and there was something in how he said it, a warmth that he still didn't quite perform, still let arrive sideways, but that was there, unmistakably, in the small exhale of it. They stood in the June morning and Ada fell, trying to turn around and got up and fell again and got up again, and eventually sat down in the dirt and decided that was acceptable, and the horses moved in the pasture behind her in the barn, the real barn now, finished, east wall extended, slightly crooked at the southwest corner of the new addition because Pete had miscalculated again, and nobody had caught it until the frame was up, stood at the edge of the yard solid and real. Boone, she said. When I got off that coach, in October. Yeah. I knew I needed somewhere to be, somewhere far enough that it would take time to find me. I didn't think. She watched Ada pick up a small piece of gravel and examine it. I didn't think it would be this. He was quiet. I mean that as a good thing, she said. I didn't think something real was possible. I'd been in something that looked like real for long enough that I'd forgotten what the actual thing felt like. She paused. It feels like this, apparently. Crooked fences and difficult horses and a daughter who falls down and gets back up like it's a personal insult. And bad accounts that got better, Boone said. And bad accounts that got better, she agreed. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I wrote a letter to Clara's sister last fall. Told her about you. About Ada. He said it simply, looking at the pasture. I'd been putting it off for years. Didn't know what to say. What did you say? I said the place was still standing, and that I'd stopped thinking of it as something to manage until I died. He paused. She wrote back. She's in Colorado. She wants to visit someday. Evelyn looked at him. I'd like that, she said. Yeah. His jaw moved. I thought you would. Ada had abandoned the gravel and was now attempting to stand again with the fence rail as support. Trouble, the difficult bay mare, had wandered close and was looking at the child with an expression that was either curiosity or mild contempt. With Trouble, it was genuinely hard to tell. Hey, Boone said, moving toward the fence. Trouble! Back up! Trouble did not back up. She lowered her nose toward Ada with the deliberateness of an animal making a considered decision, and Ada reached up and grabbed a piece of the mare's forelock with the confident grip of someone who doesn't know enough to be afraid yet. And Trouble, who had dumped Pete twice, who had made Curtis mutter under his breath for 6 years, who had nearly knocked Evelyn sideways in a burning barn, stood completely still. Boone stopped. They both watched. Ada said something that wasn't a word yet but had the intention of one. Trouble's ears moved. Huh, Boone said. Told you, Evelyn said. He looked at her. Quality, she said. You can see it if you pay attention. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that she had once read as cold and now read as what they actually were. The look of a man who is paying very close attention and has been this whole time. Yeah, he said quietly. You can. Ada let go of the forelock and fell onto her back in the dirt and looked at the sky with the expression of someone taking stock of a situation. Then she rolled over and started getting up. The morning held. The range went on in every direction, big and indifferent and completely unbothered by the small human business being conducted at its edge. The sky was doing its enormous Wyoming thing. Some things you don't choose so much as arrive at. The long result of 100 small decisions made under pressure, in the dark, with incomplete information and no guarantees. Evelyn had made a decision on a platform in Providence with $31 and a split lip and a letter from a stranger. And she had made it again in a stagecoach rolling west. And she had made it again standing in a dirt street looking at a man who walked like the ground belonged to him. And again, in all the ordinary moments that don't feel like decisions because they don't announce themselves. That was what nobody told you. That your life doesn't pivot once. It pivots constantly, in small increments. Every day you choose the same thing again. She chose this. Every morning, the crooked fence and the difficult horse, and the man who said things smaller than he meant, and the daughter who treated falling down as a problem to be solved rather than a reason to stop. She chose all of it. Ada was upright again, satisfied with herself, reaching back for the fence rail. Boone stepped forward to spot her without being asked. Evelyn watched them and felt, in the long, warm light of a June morning in Wyoming, something she had not felt in so long that she'd nearly forgotten the name for it. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness was too simple a word, too clean for what a life actually feels like from the inside. More like enough. More than enough. More than she'd known to ask for, when asking had felt impossible. She went forward to join them. The morning held and held and held. End.